with me, Colin and Richard Gando. Now, as Notts fans, we're really lucky with the rich diet that we've got available to us, whether that's Magpie Circle podcast, whether that's Notts County Talk. Obviously, it's the fantastic diet as well offered by the BBC and by our local media, but also online content like Get It Forward as well. But together, myself and Rich had a conversation, and we thought that we wanted to offer something slightly different to what we're jokingly calling that Notts Flicks diet. So, Rich, do you want to talk a little bit about where this idea came from?
Well, obviously, we're both very stats orientated in our approach towards things. I mean, I got involved in stats, and especially around football in Notts County maybe a couple of years ago, just posting bits on football forums and on Twitter and things, and it seemed to take. So obviously there was an interest there. For me, it was a bit second nature, because in a previous life, I used to sit in an office with coloured charts all around the walls, for key performance indicators, KPIs, and it was death by Excel or spreadsheet. So it's become really interesting for me to really delve into the world of football statistics, and it's every day's a learning day for me as well. But it's been great, and being able to do a podcast like this with yourself, Colin, is something that really excites me, because I think we've got some really interesting stuff to come up for viewers. Obviously, primarily we're Notts County fans, but I think there'll be some interest there further afield as well. So I'm really excited to see where this journey can take us. So that's a little bit of background on myself. What about yourself, Colin?
I'm a bit of a cliche, to be fair. So I wanted to be a footballer as a kid and dreamed all about that. And all the signs were quite good. Played for Nottingham City Boys, played for the league, did all those sort of things. Had a bit of interest from different clubs around the region. Not sadly, unfortunately. I've never really forgiven them for that. But unfortunately, a broken leg. Again, real stereotype. About 16, kind of put an end to those sort of things for a bit. So I got involved in coaching, worked for Nottingham City Council, and then ended up working on the red side of the trench, shall we say, in their academy, in their academy setup, coaching goalkeepers. And that gave me the first insight into football. But one of the things that we've talked about, and one of the things that you've definitely commented as well, is that football was often very much a closed shop. And one of the things I was always sensitive about was the fact that I'd never played professional football. And although no one explicitly said it to me, I certainly felt that I was up against it a little bit, working even at that kind of minor level, working at a kind of development centre and feeding Forest Main Academy. So I kind of went away from the game a little bit, and did my own thing, really. But football's always been an obsession. Anybody who knows me will know that I'll take any opportunity to talk about football in any way, shape or form. And then that's when Get It Forward came along. So that was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, where I saw this opportunity to merge two loves of mine. So obviously football and Notts County, but also writing as well. I read anything about football, I'll write anything about football. And so that was a fantastic platform. And I think it's something that you could probably also, acknowledge is one of the things that I found was how accessible the football world had become.
Yes.
That I've written stuff, and I've liaised with kind of national journalists as well, and been able to help them with research on articles like about Jack Grealish, for example. And that was a fantastic thing. And then I was able to kind of develop that very recently, even further, by sort of dipping back into football qualifications in terms of scouting and being able to kind of merge and get into that world as well, that I've become increasingly sort of interested in. And I know yourself, you've had obviously experience as well with people reaching out and talking about the stats. So one of the things that we thought was giving ourselves a platform, but also for everyone, making sure everybody understands who's watching it, who wants to play a role in football, that actually there is a landscape out there, and there are some quite accessible resources that you can use to have a healthy discussion about the world of football and scouting and analytics that from the outside may seem a little bit intimidating, really.
No, absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because when I first started doing the stats, I was getting carried away with just working out points per game, and it was and it was months before I even got to understand what expected goals were and things like that. But once you start to delve into it, and you start making connections, it's amazing, like you say, how accessible it can be. And there's some great people out there as well that only want to be helpful, that want to be involved, want to see you, doing the best that you can do as well, because it is such a great community, and football's all about the community as well. So hopefully what we'll be discussing here on these podcasts and getting people involved, hopefully, with what we're trying to achieve with this as well, is something that's very high on our agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I think, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of that community aspect. And one of the things that we want is people to get involved with the videos and with the things that we're doing. So we're going to talk about kind of players and targets and our own interpretations. And I think the first thing to say is, we've not got lofty expectations of ourselves. We're two blokes who are just obsessed about football and using the methods that we've got. We haven't got a direct line to the Knots hierarchy or to anybody, or certainly not yet. Anyway, this is episode 1, but but also, it's about trying to show kind of how accessible this can be, but also how healthy a discussion it can be. I think I likened it in a conversation that we had, and we've both agreed about its kind of accuracy, really, that one of the things that I see on my timeline on Twitter an awful lot is about cryptocurrency. Now, that's a world that I don't understand at all, and it's be very easy for me to dismiss that, because it just seems like an alien world with language that I don't quite understand and people that I don't quite understand, and it can feel quite intimidating, because obviously I know the currency that's in my pocket, I know the currency that's in my bank account, but I don't understand cryptocurrency. And I think it's a very similar world when it comes to analytics and statistics in football. People have been going to football 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this concept comes around that can seem very alien and can be very exclusive, and it can feel very threatening as well. But one of the things that we've realized through, first of all, the accessibility of not only the data, but also the people around football, how willing they are to reach out and discuss these ideas further, that actually we want to break down some of those barriers a little bit. And we certainly are on that journey to learning a little bit more. And as these podcasts develop, so will our understanding. But we want to try and break those barriers down to make sure that people can have a kind of healthy discussion about something that is very close to our heart, particularly with who Knots as owners are.
No, absolutely. And the key thing as well moving forward, when people do try and get involved, is not to be afraid as well to get stuck in and try and have an opinion or ask questions. We're all still learning stuff. I'm still asking questions on a daily basis about stats in general. But I know how daunting it can be for somebody who really wants to get involved, but probably isn't wanting to make a fool of themselves, whatever. Well, that's not going to happen. We're all here to try and enjoy the game as a community, and hopefully this pod will go a long way to helping people get involved and do that. So I suppose that takes us to our first port of call, does it?
Yeah, so we had this conversation about how we're going to manage our first episode, really. I think there's only really one place to start with, and that is the man of the moment, Ruben Rodrigues. And one of the reasons why we wanted to take a delve into him was because I think he's probably the most obvious aspect of Knots' recruitment using analytics. And we wanted to kind of take it almost in a chronological approach, because one of the things that I found fascinating when Knots announced the signing of Ruben was you get your typical kind of feedback via Twitter from former fans or players from his previous club and those sort of things. But we were getting an awful lot of traffic from the analyst community who'd obviously got involved and had been tracking Ruben as well. So I think that offers us a very unique look, but also the fact that there's an awful lot of data at the moment really sort of celebrating what he's doing for Knots. And we wanted to also, and one of the things that we'll get into a little bit more is probably talking about the future with or without Ruben Rodrigues, because as we know from Brentford, for example, when you have this sort of policy where you're identifying players who are undervalued, as soon as they become valued, there's a very good chance that you're going to be moving that player on, and you need to be finding the next one. In fact, just before we started recording the Evening Post, we're demonstrating the need for Knots to be proactive in that market and in that transfer market. And although I'm sure they're not actively looking to recruit a replacement for Ruben, I'm sure it's not too far from their minds as well.
No, absolutely. So If we think about Ruben then, and I suppose the first thing that we can think about is trying to get a head around the new owners. Well, I say new owners, are not so new now, obviously, but the Reeds brothers and the whole football radar thing, and how signings like Ruben or even Elijah Sam may have come about. You know, again, probably even Cal Roberts, Lewis Knight. I'm not entirely sure how they came, along as well, but certainly we can say with some surety that both Ruben and Elijah were definitely what we would term football radar signings. So I think we've been having a look at how that might have come about and the sort of metrics that the owners would have been looking at to try and identify those kind of players.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to start us off really in terms of this timeline. There's a guy on Twitter, and again, thinking about kind of the availability of people on Twitter who are working, within the game in scouting analytics. So Blades Analytic is his Twitter handle. He was one of the first people who I saw kind of be really bowled over by the fact that Notts County in the National League had been able to recruit Ruben. It was very open by the fact that he'd been recommending this player in the Dutch second division. To clubs a lot higher than us, and so was really surprised that we were able to recruit him. So that certainly whetted my appetite for a player before he even, hit the pitch. And I think that also proves, and I think it also shows that, this is quite a tough market to be in, in terms of the transfer market and the analytics business. And so that gave me some confidence of the player that we were going to see. And some of the data and some of the stats that we found on him, and obviously, one of the things that we want to talk about is kind of the availability of our data is limited somewhat. We need to understand that the level of data, even though hopefully people at home are going to find really impressive and find some learning to take from, we accept as well that the data available to the likes of Football Radar is going to be, beyond this, and going into real kind of finite detail. But I mean, I think the standout features with his time at Den Bosch. I think he played 27 games, of which there was 23 starts. And he was scoring goals in those 27 games. He scored 12 goals. And it goes back to what you were saying actually at the start, that, even though that's a very simplistic headline figure, that's not a bad return for that particular player. And so you could understand why that would have triggered quite a few people and brought him to kind of prominence. But I think the thing that was quite interesting for me was you were able to look at some data from Y-Scout, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things that I'm fascinated by is not just the data, but tactical shape as well, because I think obviously the tactical shape allows players to do certain things on a pitch. And obviously where you put them allows their metrics to change slightly, because there's certain things you would expect them to do, or you would need them to do in one position that you perhaps don't need them to do. And one of the things that stood out for me was at Den Bosch, it seems as though he was used in that kind of what we're going to call that number 10 role. I hope Stan Collimore's not listening, because like I say, he'll be blowing his top already with the jargon that we're throwing out there, but playing in that kind of deeper forward line, exploiting that gap between the midfield and the front. But he was also out wide left, using that right foot of his to cut inside. And we have seen this at Notts. We have seen this quite a few times. But I find it very interesting, and we'll talk about this much more, that Notts have, certainly under Ian Birchall, moved him far more centrally. Yes. And when we start to look at the data of Ruben currently, I wanted to point out just a few things about the benefits of that decision, but also some of Ruben's kind of drawbacks, because, all players are going to have drawbacks, and sure, perhaps why they've moved him slightly more centrally. So I think it's important to understand that although, the Ruben Rodrigues that we see has maintained that goal scoring from Den Bosch, I think it's also important to understand that he's been moved slightly on the pitch, and we're seeing some added benefits, I think, to his game.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the things that certainly have stood out for myself, as you say, I think he was playing a little bit left-sided at Den Bosch. And he has shown, like you said as well, when he's been playing for Notts, that he's very effective still. When he's playing out wide. But without a doubt, since he's been given that freedom in a more central role to roam, Just and the link-up play between himself and Wootton already is starting to bear some fruit as well. But in particular, one of his core strengths seems to be, and there are two or three of them, is obviously his dribbling ability. So one of the things that I've picked up on just here is 78% possession maintained in dribbles. So far this season, not including the Bromley game, so we didn't have the data for that. 142 dribbles, and 109 of those he managed to maintain possession, and that's some going.
And I think it's some going for several reasons, really. I think one of the things that we're all very familiar with, for those who've gone into the streams quite regularly, and obviously those who went to a lot of away fixtures when we were able to go to away fixtures, is the range of surfaces that he'll be doing that on as well. For him to be able to maintain that possession on a range of surfaces and a range of conditions is very important. And I think also, I feel one of the standout features of a player who's got a chance is when they become prominent, like Ruben is being at the minute. Like I say, social media is full of a lot of praise for Ruben Rodrigues, not just from Notts County fans, but people from outside the club who've recognised that. And I think as a real highlight to look for, I think, is how does that player cope with that extra pressure? And the opposition are going to be very much aware of that stat. And you've seen it in a few games that he ends up being double or triple marked sometime in terms of the closing down. And he's still been able to maintain that possession. And hopefully, obviously, as a Notts fan, that continues. But I think that's a mark of a player who can cope with that extra pressure and still keep that particular stat incredibly high.
No, definitely. And if I can do, I'm just going to try and share a quick visualization here, Colin. I might end up blocking one of us off. It's probably going to be yourself, so I do apologise just for a few minutes while I share this with everybody. Sorry about that, Colin. Here we go. So, here's Ruben's dribbles in the final third, and you can see there that there is definitely that bias towards the left side a little bit, and that's because he's certainly under Neil Warnock when he did get Neil Ardley when he got to play. Was that just wishful thinking then? Sorry. He did tend to sort of be pushed out, out wide certainly when we had that little spell of the 4-2-3-1. He was probably pushing out a little wide as well, and it seemed to be swapping between himself and Elijah Sam. But when you have a look at that there, you can see just how active he can be in that final third, and what a threat he is as well.
It's where those goals are coming from as well, isn't it? Those goals are central, and so you've got a player, and this is obviously no criticism of Ardley or anybody like that. I don't want to get into that narrative at all. But where those goals are coming from are central, and again, it also shows just how complex, and hopefully what this data shows, which is really impressive data, by the way, Rich. Thanks for sharing that. But it shows the complexity of the manager's decisions as well. Is that how do you judge the effectiveness of the opposition? So we might find Ian Bertrand playing Ruben on the left-hand side, despite what we're saying, but that might be down to the fact that he considers the fullback he's up against to be slightly weaker, or that he'll be able to attack and cut in, if you like, into that middle as well. Because as those graphics shows, that the places where he's scoring the goals is that bang in the centre, maybe just on the edge of the 18-yard.
Yeah, well, another stat that I picked up on, which I've not got a visual or anything for at the moment, but when you drill down onto those stats and you have a look at his dribbling and possession and where he's most effective, and against which type of opposition, he tends to be much more effective when he's facing that central defensive midfielder and then a centre back. Without a doubt, and that's probably down to he's obviously got a little bit of pace about him as well. He's obviously very gifted with the ball, but being able to just almost glide past if you've got a defensive central midfielder who's obviously not going to be the fastest person in the world. He's either going to take him down and we get a nice dangerous free kick, or he's not going to see him for dust. So I think that's one area why he's that sort of effective in that position there, without a doubt. I mean, so far this season, not including the Bromley game, those dribbles resulted in 40 shots on goal, and
fantastic, isn't it? Absolutely fantastic.
And I think there's five goals come from that as well. So that's the kind of impact he can have. I've got another question actually, Colin, that's come to mind while we've been talking about this. And obviously you mentioned that the thing with a player like Ruben is, and we've seen it before with Enzio Baldwin, with Cal Roberts, and that's the opposition ganging up on him. When you start thinking about those other players I've just mentioned, and imagine if we'd got a fit Cal Roberts on the pitch as well at the moment, what as a team defending, what do they do about that to try and combat that?
I was going to say, having I think that's probably one of the biggest sort of frustrations that Notts fans have felt, is not having those two on the pitch and learning how to work with each other and how to orchestrate, because the stretching effect that would have on a team, because you wouldn't be able to prioritize this one particular threat, because you wouldn't be able to take your eye off, the other player, you know what I mean? And both of those players are really mobile in terms of finding those spaces as well. And I think also this is where, again, talking about stats, the National League produced that stat about Michael Doyle as well, and about his forward passes. If you imagine that he had not just Ruben to distribute that ball to, but also Cal Roberts as well, the impact that would have would probably have found us not still looking at the fact that we're still having to cement at least a playoff place.
No, absolutely. Well, what I want to do is just on that, just to try and give a visualization of the impact one player like Ruben can have. Again, sort of breaking into the penalty area and causing havoc in the defence. I'm sorry, I've lost you again there, Colin. I do apologise for that. But
it's better than I do, don't worry.
Yeah. These are penalty area deliveries, and you can see there just how effective Ruben alone has been in that final third of getting Notts into those dangerous areas in and around the penalty area. I mean, there's a lot of activity there, and when that's happening, and as we've seen in the last few games, it starts to create a lot of chances. And I think looking at that picture there, that image, I just find that really impressive.
It's really impressive, and I'll tell you something as well that it sort of fits the narrative with the Y-Scout data that we were looking at. It looks at strengths and it looks at negatives as well, and I think it's important to look at those as well, to understand perhaps why positional decisions have been made. One of the things that I think Ruben struggles with a little bit, and I think there's lots of reasons for that, is that vertical or horizontal long pass. So he's brilliant at passing the ball short, and one of the things that graphic showed was that when he's out wide, and I think it's been communicated to him probably that this isn't a great strength of his. There was 1 or 2 assists on there that demonstrate he can do it, but he will carry it. So he'll carry the ball in those kind of wide positions and dribble, because it's not really his strength to hit that kind of long angled pass. And so that's good justification, I think, for not starting him out wide, because really his only option is to dribble. Now he does that fantastically well, but having him central, and you've talked brilliantly, and I agree completely with you about Kyle Wootton, that link-up play. But Kyle Wootton's not going to be too far away. And so you've got that link-up passing that means that he doesn't have to rely on that kind of big angled ball, that sort of like ambitious ball, that Hollywood ball, if you want that phrase. But I think also some of that is down to, we need to understand that Ruben's not always been in the team, and there's lack sharpness. And I think, Neil Ardley and Andy and Birchnell have sort of raised concerns in different ways about whether that was fitness or whether that was just kind of mentality or whatever. But I think with perhaps with more regularity, you know, the fact that he's riding on this crest of the wave, maybe we're going to start seeing that start change a little bit. Maybe we are going to see that little bit of flair, that bit of confidence to actually, I am going to try and ping this, you know, because he is riding the crest of the wave that hopefully we hope was take us all the way to the playoff final.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at his passing stats. His highest percentage was actually passes between 20 and 30 meters. And I think it was something like 86% pass completion for passes in that sort of range. And when you think about that link-up play with Kyle Wootton that we've been talking about, and you imagine them both in that 20 to 30 meter triangle, circle, whatever you want to call it, you know, on that front line, you can see why that's starting to become so efficient. And I think as well, Kyle Wootton's proven to be the perfect foil for Ruben as well. Let's hope that we get to see a lot more of that before the end of this season. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about Ruben and the benefits, and now we've shared some of the data and the stats that we've been able to get hold of that will probably give people a bit more of an insight into the sort of things that the owners would have been looking at when they're scouting new talent, if you like, trying to identify new talent, footballing talent. And it then begs the question, you know, obviously at some point, the whole point of this is, as you said right at the beginning of this episode, is that, you know, we're not going to keep these players forever. You know, at some point, somebody's going to, you know, want to come in for Ruben, and if the price is right, you know, you wouldn't disagree with him moving on and being sold and make, you know, if that helps to make the club more sustainable as well, which is what we think this is all about also, then so be it. So we don't want to think about it at the moment, but I mean, life after Ruben Rodrigues, what do we think?
Well, I think there's good news and bad news. And I'll start with the good news first. The good news is that I think when we compare, and I've got a few people to thank for this. So we've got Liam Henshaw, who's obviously been on Twitter and talked about kind of Ruben's current stats. And there is a fantastic crossover with a piece written by Scouted Football, who are, again, a fantastic organisation who do a print magazine as well as their own podcast as well. They did an article on Cal Roberts. I think it was just before the playoff final. And they've used similar data and they've used similar metrics to look at the players. So it's really easy to be able to look across those two players. And I think Cal Robertson and Ruben Rodrigues have very similar strengths. And like we talked about, really, is unfortunately, there's a huge disappointment of not having them on the pitch at the same time. Yeah. But if you look at things like dribbles, for example, so we were talking about kind of how often, how much expected dribbles that Ruben has, or how many dribbles does he have per game. So Ruben's at somewhere around 6.2, something like that, dribbles per game. And Cal was at something like 5.6 last season. So not too far away from each other in terms of very similar performances. Expected assists, Cal's actually slightly higher. So although we've talked about Ruben's sort of short passing game and how sort of beneficial that has been, it doesn't always necessarily lead directly, I think, to a goal. There's always a kind of another movement off there, et cetera, even though with the naked eye, we can see that he's played a significant role. Cal's expected assist is actually slightly higher at 0.5. Now, there is a very obvious reason for that, and that is that Cal Roberts is a prolific set-piece taker, whereas Ruben does take some set pieces, but I don't think that's particularly a strength to his game. But I think that should give us some confidence, at least, in terms of, you know, when Cal gets back and is fully fit and does take the pitch with or without Ruben, that he's going to be able to provide something very similar. And then just as a final sort of metric, those average shots per games, you know, is something around Ruben's 2.6. I think Cal's 2.7. So again, you know, we'll at least have one player on the pitch that will be able to kind of provide something that Ruben is currently providing at the moment. But obviously, as a Notts fan, we hope that both make it onto the pitch and are able to do the business. But you're right, we have got to be open and honest and understanding that this form of recruitment is about identifying undervalued players and then being able to move them on with their value increasing. So then we start to think about, okay, so Ruben moves on, who or what else? And this is where the bad news comes in, is that with Ruben's metrics, there isn't a ready-made player, I don't think, or certainly from the superficial sort of look that we've been able to manage with the available data that there isn't an absolutely nailed-on player that can do everything that Ruben does. So you will be able to find a player with a very similar kind of dribbling outcome, but won't be able to get the expected shots off, for example. And that's probably because they're playing out left, for example, or they're playing out right rather than that kind of central role. So you've then got a couple of options. You start to think, and again, this is a process that you and I have both sort of looked at through our kind of different courses that we've taken. You start to think, okay, right, so does the tactical shape change? So do we play and keep with that kind of number 10 role and look for another number 10 who we accept? Probably hasn't got everything in his locker that Ruben's got, but will be able to provide some of those things. And then, like I say, hopefully Cal Roberts comes back, appears on either the right-hand side or the left-hand side of the number 10 to provide some of that data, some of that performance that we would lose if Ruben went. And for me, a player that we should probably look at, but it comes with a huge warning that this is not a transfer target. This is not someone who I think Notts County could go out and sign on a permanent basis, but perhaps on a loan, is someone like Zach Brunt.
Yeah.
So Zach Brunt, for those people, for those people who think I know that name. So Michael Calvin did a fantastic. First of all, he wrote a fantastic book called No Hunger in Paradise, which was about young players. But the TV adaptation focused partly on Zach Brunt. So Zach Brunt is fairly local from Chesterfield and shot to prominence as a young player, and ended up moving very regularly in his younger days. And part of the Michael Calvin sort of documentary is about how he and his family kind of regret that decision to keep moving around. He ended up at Matlock Town because of a contractual dispute, which meant that he couldn't play league football without costing someone quite a pricely sum. So one of the benefits with him straight away is that he has played, first team level at Matlock Town. So he knows how to rough it. He knows how to, he knows what's coming in terms of lower league football. But he's ended up at Sheffield United. And I've watched a few of his games because Sheffield United, first of all, their development broadcast their games on YouTube. So that's another fantastic resource for anybody who's sat here going, do you know what, I'd really like to look at potential players. YouTube, looking at the under 23 pages of some of these clubs and finding their links to games is a fantastic resource. And I've looked at a few of the games, and one of the things that I've found is that he is really natural in that position of that number 10 role. I've seen him being used across the midfield three. So I've seen him on the left-hand side of a centre or right-hand side of a centre and swapped around, but I don't think he's as effective as he is playing in that kind of central role and really being able to kind of find those kind of half spaces, if you like, and manipulate them really well. I don't feel that he's got Ruben's fantastic dribbling ability. He's not someone who's going to get the ball and dribble it every single time. But one of the things he's got is that fantastic awareness in and around the box, and he gets shots off. So in the game that I watched, he got an assist, he got a goal, and that was all down to kind of very clever positional play where he finds the gap. He hangs off a little bit, he waits for bits to come out. Great feet as well. It's fantastic feet, fantastic technique. He's also able to provide something that I think Ruben isn't as strong with, which is that, like we've talked about before, is that slightly longer vertical pass. Because I think he's used to playing quite deep in the central midfield, and because he's got very pacey forwards, his accuracy with passing is probably a little bit beyond what we've seen Ruben be able to do. But again, some of that could be down to tactical decisions. Now, anyone listening might be thinking, come on, this is a lad at Sheffield United. Are we really going to be able to recruit him? But I'd point out that this is a lad who's 19 years old. He's already playing under 23 football. He's playing in the same side as Sam Graham, who we got on loan at Notts. So, it's not beyond us to be able to recruit somebody in from that position and be able to kind of get them in on loan. So I think that's something that I would say. And I think also as well, if you look at Sheffield United as a club, because I think this is something as well that you've got to understand, which is the context of a particular club. They're galvanising themselves for a season in the Championship. I think with Brexit and all those kind of ramifications, they need to think even more, not just Sheffield United, every club needs to look slightly more proactively at blooding their youngsters and giving their British players game time, because they can't go out and recruit from Scandinavia or from wherever else. They were going to be bringing players in who were again, slightly under market value and be able to bring them along. So that plays into Notts' hands, as well as the kind of geography of not being too far, as well as previously having contact with Sheffield United with Sam Graham. So there's some of the things that I would highlight. But again, you know, he is very well liked. I think also, you know, there's still up in the air about whether the former under-23 Sheffield United manager will become first team manager. So obviously that might speed Zach Brunt's sort of progress into the first team. But that's certainly a player who I think could play that particular role. But then also, like I say, you know, one of the things that's been talked about a lot is Ian Burchnell preferring, you know, a 4-3-3, for example, which is something that he's played before. So we might actually not need another Ruben Rodrigues, because one of the things, and again, I know Moneyball becomes a catch-all phrase because of the kind of the success of the Billy Bean story and stuff. But one of the things that comes out of that film is the fact that they're trying to replace one particular player. And he's saying you don't necessarily have to replace that player with someone who does exactly the same job. What you can do is you can spread what they do over 2 or 3 positions. So just like we've talked about previously, Cal Roberts could provide that role maybe on the right-hand side or the left-hand side of a Kyle Wootton, for example. But then you also start to think, right, well, we need to bring a midfielder in who can bring some of the other stuff in that perhaps Cal isn't able to do, or we can't just rely on Cal to do. So that, like I say, that starts to bring in a whole wider range of options, and then with your scouting, you start to look at, okay, who have we got who's available, who can, all right, maybe not get the amount of shots off per game because they're going to be playing from a slightly deeper position, but actually who's fantastic at kind of set pieces, or who can get the ball down and dribble, or even kind of like we talked about with Michael Doyle, who can get those forward passes to give it to the players like Cal Roberts and whoever we put on the other side. In order to kind of regenerate that same sort of data, but from a very different tactical standpoint.
No, absolutely. And you made another really good point there as well, when you brought up the whole Brexit thing and the pool of talent that may or may not be available on a wider scale for a club at our level. And so, you know, when we're talking about players like Zach Brunt, who's obviously local, you know, there's got to be a real opportunity for us to really drill down into that local pool of talent, and, you know, see if there are any rough diamonds there that we can. I think
this is something that I'll throw out as well. You know, when we're talking about players that we recommend, I think there was some interesting media sort of, I won't call them slips, because obviously it was just quite an honest conversation. But when Ian Burchnell and Maurice Ross first came to the club, they did allow themselves to talk a little bit about transfer policy before sort of stopping themselves and saying, oh, you know, we don't want to say too much. Yeah. But a couple of things that came out from that was that they wanted to bring the average age of the squad down, and they wanted to try and develop sellable assets. So that's something that I've kind of factored in as well. So with the players that I may suggest on this podcast, so like Zach Brunt, for example, who I don't think we'd be able to ever recruit full time, but we'd be able to bring in. But if we're also thinking about players who become available, I think we need to think about that dynamic. That are they someone who can be coached and brought on? I think everybody watching this would say that Ian Burchnell certainly demonstrated an ability to bring players on and develop them. And also, could we sell them on? Could we move them on? Now, there's an added dimension that I've added there in terms of the regional aspect, because I've written, you know, a previous blog about Notts not necessarily living in fear of the academies that surround us, the huge academies that we've got, you know, Premier League academies, etc. But actually starting to use them more as a resource. So starting to see, as we are at the moment, you know, it's retained list time, you know, so players are being jettisoned left, right, and centre. Well, some of these players have had, you know, maybe 10 years of development or more, a Premier League academy, or, you know, a real sort of top end academy. And maybe Notts need to be a little bit more proactive about picking those players up and giving them an opportunity. I mean, one name to look out for is Michael Tate at Aston Villa, who is 20 years old, plays in that kind of number 10 role. I think with again, one of the problems that we've come up against is the availability of under 23 data and under 18 data. But the little bit I could find is that in Premier League 2 under 23, he's played 9 games, got 2 assists. And like I say, a couple of those have actually been coming on from sub as well. So he has that ability to make an impact. whether he's got that ability to make that impact in the full 90 minutes, whether he's got that kind of physical kind of capability to play National League, that's where your eyes on scouting, I think, comes in as well. But
yeah,
I've added that extra dimension as well into whenever we talk about a particular player, that, is there someone fairly local? Is there someone who we could sort of tap into and use that kind of that geographical knowledge? Because I know people respect and know Notts County, but I think people within the region have got a better appreciation of the size of club we were, and maybe we become a little bit more of an attractive proposition to someone who, let's say, is down south, who perhaps doesn't understand the club quite as well.
No, absolutely. Well, I think we've covered some really interesting ground there for a first episode, Colin, would you say?
Yeah, definitely so. Really enjoyable.
Yeah, and it's important that if this is going to go the way we'd like it to go, that's not going to happen without the rest of the fellow fans out there and football fans in general, because although we've got a Notts bias, we will be spreading our wings a little bit. We've spoken about a young lad at Aston Villa and a young lad at Sheffield United here, so we really enjoy it if and like it if people were able to get involved, get in touch. You'll be seeing the Twitter account will be out soon, so it will be at Analysts Bar. And yeah, get in touch, because I think there's some really interesting stuff there, and I've really enjoyed this. Really enjoyed it, Colin.
Yeah, same. Yeah, thanks for everything you've provided in terms of the data. And I think one of the things that we should be able to do is support people in not only just throwing out a name, but also points them in the right direction of being able to find where some of this data is, some of the freely available stuff, as well as kind of linking them up with some of the names we've mentioned, in terms of Scouting Football, Liam Henshaw, etc., etc. So, like I say, by all means, get in contact with us, via the Twitter feed and stuff, and responding to this and sharing this as far and wide as possible, because we want to kind of widen that conversation and kind of demystify a bit about this kind of scouting, this form of recruitment, because I know that there's an awful lot of people out there who are interested and want to know more.
No, absolutely. Well, that was great. Really insightful. Thanks a lot, Colin. I look forward to doing the next episode, and look forward to getting some feedback from the other guys out there as well. So that's great.
Catch you again. See you later.
Cheers. Bye.